A cold Saturday in Ottawa, a busy weekend calendar, and a major U.S. court ruling that could still end up on Canadian invoices. Later in the brief, I'll tell you the one detail in the tariff decision that matters most if you sell into or buy from. Ottawa's weather first. Expect a high around -3 degrees Celsius and a low near -12, with light snow. If you're looking for something local to do, a few options stand out this weekend. The RCMP musical ride stables have an open house, the Metcalfe Farmers Market is running, and the Ottawa Senators have a skills competition event on the schedule. And a quick transit check-in. OC Transpo says bus service should look closer to normal by early spring, but not overnight. The immediate problem has been reliability. Hundreds of canceled trips at the low point in early January, linked to an aging fleet and a maintenance backlog. The city says a small number of new buses are already in service, with dozens of new electric buses expected by the end of March. On Line 1, several train cars are still out of rotation after a wheel assembly issue was detected in late January. Transit officials say they'll only return cars when they're confident they're safe, and there's still no clear timeline for when full capacity is back. Turning now to the bigger national and cross-border thread, the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's broad emergency tariffs, ruling by a 6-3 vote that the president didn't have authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often called IEEPA, to set tariff rates that widely. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the majority, and the core logic is straightforward. These tariffs function like a tax on U.S. importers, and taxing power sits with Congress unless Congress clearly delegates it. The court also pointed out something important. It's not saying the president has no trade tools. It's saying this particular emergency law wasn't the right one for sweeping tariffs. Here's the key point for Canada. This decision removes one major legal basis for broad across-the-board duties, but it does not automatically end the tariffs that are still in place under other authorities. That matters because a lot of the most painful Canada-specific files, steel and aluminum, autos, and some lumber and forestry products, can be pursued through other legal routes in the U.S., including more targeted investigations. The White House signaled it plans to move quickly. President Trump said he'll pursue a new 10% global tariff using other statutes, and he specifically referenced the 1974 Trade Act, suggesting a tariff that could be time-limited, potentially around 150 days, while also pointing to additional Commerce Department investigations that could produce more sector-by-sector duties. What's still unclear, and what businesses will be watching closely, which countries would be covered, whether prior exemptions would carry over, and how CUSMA-compliant goods would be treated this time. Under the now-invalidated emergency tariffs, CUSMA goods were often treated differently or exempted, and that distinction mattered for a lot of shipments moving through Ontario and Quebec. Mid-brief reset. If you remember one thing, it's that the Supreme Court narrowed the emergency route, but it didn't close the tariff toolbox. So uncertainty drops a bit today, but it doesn't disappear. Markets reflected that. U.S. stocks moved modestly higher, gains that suggest investors expected this outcome, or at least don't see it as a sudden shock. At the same time, investors are still trying to price a U.S. economy that's growing slowly, fourth quarter growth around 1.4% annualized, while inflation remains stubborn enough to complicate when or whether the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates. Gold gave back some gains after the ruling, but stayed supported by the weaker growth picture. In Canada, the reaction from political leaders was cautiously positive. Ontario's premier called it an important win, while also warning the fight isn't over as long as sector tariffs remain. Other provincial leaders echoed that same theme. Good news on process and precedent, but not the end of trade risk. And trade experts are warning that if broad emergency tariffs are harder to use, the next phase could be more targeted, by product or even by province, depending on how future investigations are framed. Now, quick local context before we wrap. Ottawa has a new long-range population forecast on the table. A city commission projection suggests Ottawa could reach roughly 1.68 million residents by 2051, up from about 1.15 million in 2024. An average of around 20,000 additional residents per year. The city uses this kind of forecast to plan housing, infrastructure, and services, and it will feed into decisions like whether to expand the urban boundary or push harder on intensification. In the final minute, here's what to watch next. On tariffs, the next concrete marker is not the court ruling. It's what legal authority the White House uses next, and how narrowly or broadly it's written. The practical question for Canadian exporters will be, are CUSMA-compliant goods explicitly protected, and do any sector investigations expand beyond what's already in play? On Ottawa Transit, the timeline to watch is end of March, when the city expects the big wave of new electric buses to be available, and any update on when Line 1 cars return to service. And on city growth, the next decision points will come as planners translate that 2051 number into near-term choices, housing targets, servicing, and where growth actually goes. That's the brief for Saturday, February 21st. Thanks for listening. Stay warm, and we'll keep an eye on what changes and what doesn't.